terminal was already buzzing with the impatient rhythm of early morning travel when the laughter started, sharp, careless, the kind that cuts through crowds. It came from behind the TSA security podium, where three young officers leaned over the conveyor belt and stared at the elderly man placing his belongings into a faded plastic tray. "Sir," the lead screener said, loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "you can't bring this prehistoric thing onto a plane." He held up a tiny, worn coin knife, barely 2 inches long, its hinge rusted, the metal dull from decades of handling. The old man, Thomas Tom Granger, 82, looked up with steady gray eyes that carried storms long past. His face was a map of years etched deep, framed by a snowy white beard, and his faded red work shirt hung loosely against a wiry frame. His blue jeans were worn at the seams, and his boots, cracked and scuffed, marked countless miles walked across quieter roads. He said nothing, he simply nodded, accepting the confiscation with a gentle, almost apologetic motion. That quietness only fueled the mockery. Another officer snickered. "Going to war with that, Grandpa?" A third chimed in. "Bet he doesn't even remember putting it in there." Passengers shifted uncomfortably. A few looked away, others watched with morbid curiosity, sensing the imbalance of power. Tom remained still, framed by the humming conveyor belt and the cold fluorescent lights that washed out the colors of the terminal. He did not raise his voice. He did not protest. He simply lifted his small carry-on, patched, frayed, and older than most people in the line, and stepped forward when told. "Hold up," the lead screener barked. "Random secondary screening." It wasn't random, and everyone knew it. Tom paused, then nodded once. His movements were slow but deliberate, every gesture controlled. As he lifted his arms for the wanding procedure, his sleeve shifted slightly, revealing the edge of an old service tattoo, faded, nearly invisible, but unmistakably military. One of the younger officers snorted. "Oh, come on, that your fake tough guy ink!" Another laughed. "Probably got it on spring break in the 70s. The wand beeped faintly at the bracelet on Tom's wrist, a simple metal band engraved with names too small to read from a distance. "Take it off," the officer demanded. Tom hesitated, just a breath, just enough for the room to feel the shift. "It stays," he said quietly, his voice low but firm enough to halt the officer mid-step. That same officer rolled his eyes. "Sir, remove!" Then the bracelet caught the light, a glint, a pattern, a series of symbols known only to a fraction of the nation. The officer stopped talking. The other two noticed the pause and leaned closer. One's face paled. Then behind the podium a screen flashed red, loud, unmistakable. "Alert! DHS priority identification match level 1." The terminal fell silent. TSA agents froze mid-movement. Supervisors snapped their heads toward the alarm. The crowd stopped breathing because the system had recognized the bracelet and the name attached to it. Thomas Granger wasn't just an elderly passenger. He was something else entirely, something the younger officers had only heard whispers about in training. A Medal of Honor alert had just triggered, and the world around him shifted. The silence that followed the alarm was sharp enough to cut through the recycled airport air, and for the first time that morning, the three young TSA officers stopped smirking. The red alert banner continued pulsing on their monitor, casting a harsh glow over their faces as they stared in disbelief. The passengers behind Tom shifted, sensing the sudden unease ripple through the checkpoint. A supervisor, a stocky man in his mid-40s with a neatly trimmed beard and sharp brown eyes, appeared from behind the security booth, drawn by the alarm. His expression was tight with annoyance, ready to discipline whatever rookie had tripped a system alert. But then he saw the screen. His face drained of color. Who did this scan?" he asked, voice trembling despite his attempt to mask it. The lead screener raised a shaky hand. "I don't know what's happening, sir. I swear I didn't touch anything." The supervisor ignored him, stepping closer to the monitor. Lines of data were scrolling, service records, citations, redacted sections, and at the top of the alert, a small, grainy photograph of a young man in uniform. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same eyes, just harder and sharper with youth. Tom Granger remained still as stone, his arms lowered now, his bracelet glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights. "Sir," the supervisor said slowly, stepping around the podium and approaching him, "may I ask your full name for verification?" Tom hesitated, his gaze drifting to the people watching, the families gripping luggage, the businessmen half-turned from the conveyor belt, a little boy clinging to his father's leg while peeking up at him with curious eyes. Then he said softly, "Thomas Raymond Granger." The supervisor inhaled sharply. Behind him, two of the young officers exchanged bewildered glances. The third, the loudest of the group, looked suddenly nauseous, the weight of his earlier taunt settling heavily on him. "You're telling me this old man is the Thomas Granger? No way!" he muttered under his breath, but the words lacked their earlier bravado. The supervisor's radio crackled violently. A voice came through, urgent, clipped, official. Checkpoint 4, stand by. DHS command verifying Medal of Honor protocol activation. Hold position. Do not move the subject. Repeat, do not move the subject. The young officers stiffened. The gravity of the situation hit them like a tidal wave. Tom's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted, an old, weary acceptance, as if he'd been through this before and found no pride in it. The crowd didn't understand what was happening, but they sensed the tension thickening. Between the tightening ring of TSA agents and the rigid stance of the supervisor, an unspoken truth was forming. The officer who'd mocked the bracelet stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, the bracelet, what are those names?" For the first time, Tom looked directly at him. No anger, no resentment, only a deep, fathomless sadness. "They were my men," he said quietly. And the young officer took a step back, his face crumbling with realization, just as a flash of memory surged in Tom's mind: heat, sand, screaming, the deafening roar of enemy fire. A helicopter spinning smoke across a desert sky. A promise whispered to dying brothers. His grip tightened unconsciously on the strap of his faded carry-on. The past was returning with brutal clarity. The radio on the supervisor's belt crackled again, this time louder, sharper, carrying the unmistakable edge of someone high in the chain of command. "Checkpoint 4, confirm. The alert reads Thomas Raymond Granger. Over." The entire TSA line had gone still. Even the conveyor belt seemed quieter, its mechanical hum overshadowed by the growing dread settling over the young officers. The supervisor pressed the radio to his mouth. "Affirmative. Name matches." Bracelet triggered it. The voice on the other end paused. A long, heavy silence. Then, "Jesus Christ, stand by. DHS command is en route. Clear a path. Do not repeat, do not detain or question him further." The supervisor's eyes widened as he slowly looked up at Tom. "Sir, we didn't know." Tom gave a small nod. "You weren't supposed to." Behind the podium, the youngest officer, Kyle, with the loud mouth and the cocky grin that had vanished entirely, swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed as he stared at the faded bracelet engraved with names he now understood were carved into history. "Sir," he whispered, voice cracking, "were you know, there?" Tom didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was confirmation enough. But inside his mind, the floodgates opened again, heat so intense it peeled paint from metal. A pinned-down patrol in the Korangal, outnumbered 20-1, the gunner screaming for help as he bled out behind a shattered Humvee. The smell of burning rubber, cordite, and blood blending into one suffocating cloud. Tom dragging a wounded man, sergeant, father of 3, through a hailstorm of AK rounds. The moment he realized the helicopter wasn't coming. The moment he went back anyway, because 2 men were still alive in a ditch 50 yards away. His hand twitched around the handle of his carry-on. The memory faded. The airport returned. Passengers were filming now, but quietly, respectfully, not understanding, but sensing something monumental was unfolding. Then the supervisor's phone rang. He answered. His face went gray. Yes, sir, he's here, Roger." That understood. He hung up and approached Tom with reverence bordering on fear. "Mr. Granger, the Director of Homeland Security is on his way." Around them, gasps rippled through the waiting crowd. Kyle and the other young officers looked like they wanted to sink into the linoleum. The weight of their insults, grandpa, fake tough guy ink, prehistoric knife, hung around their necks like anvils. Tom simply nodded again. He didn't enjoy the fuss. He never had. "Do you need a seat, sir?" One officer stammered. "I'm fine." "Would you like water?" "No, thank you." Passengers parted like water around him, giving him space he hadn't asked for. Then a new voice cut through the tension. Calm, older, steady. It belonged to the TSA regional director, a man in his late 50s with graying temples, striding fast toward the checkpoint. He took one look at Tom and froze mid-step as recognition struck like lightning. Good God! He straightened his uniform, his face tightening with sudden military precision. Then he stepped forward and lowered his voice. "Mr. Granger, sir, may I ask, why didn't you tell them who you were?" Tom looked at the 3 trembling young officers. They didn't ask. And somewhere down the concourse, far off, but getting closer, the echo of polished shoes, urgent footsteps, and a security escort signaled that someone very powerful was approaching. A wave of movement rolled down the terminal as if an invisible hand swept the air clean. Conversations died. Rolling suitcases slowed. Even the overhead announcements seemed to fade as a cluster of DHS agents in dark suits strode down the concourse with urgent, disciplined steps. At their center walked a man who commanded the space without raising his voice, a tall, silver-haired figure in his late 50s with the crisp bearing of someone who had never fully left the military behind. His name, Director Samuel Hartley, was spoken with quiet authority across federal agencies, but here now, as he stepped into Checkpoint 4, he moved with something entirely different in his eyes. Not power, recognition, and reverence. The TSA staff snapped into stiff, stunned postures as the director approached. The three young officers who had mocked Tom earlier stood frozen, faces colorless and taut. The supervisor swallowed loudly, sweat forming along his brow. Passengers instinctively stepped back, forming a wide circle, as if witnessing a ceremony they did not fully understand but dared not interrupt. Hartley didn't slow. His gaze locked on Tom Granger the moment he spotted the faded red shirt and weathered frame standing quietly beside the conveyor belt. Tom did not move. He simply waited, calm as still water. When the director reached him, he stopped abruptly, then drew himself up to full height. The agents behind him fell silent, watching. Hartley didn't extend his hand. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he lifted his right hand in a sharp, flawless salute, the kind delivered only to a superior in spirit, if not rank. Gasps rippled around the checkpoint. Phones lowered. Even children sensed something monumental unfolding. Tom hesitated, startled, but only for a fraction of a second. Old instinct surged through him, straightening his back, squaring his shoulders. His age seemed to lift off him like a shadow. And in that moment, he returned a salute so clean, so impossibly precise that the room exhaled as one. The director's voice came low, thick with emotion. "Sergeant First Class Thomas Raymond Granger, United States Army, it is an honor to stand in your presence." The young officer who had mocked him stumbled backward, the blood draining from his face as his knees buckled. The other two looked equally shaken, their arrogance melted into silent horror. Hartley continued, voice growing stronger, carrying across the terminal. "This man," he said, sweeping his hand toward Tom, "received the Medal of Honor for actions in the Korengal Valley, actions that saved an entire platoon and cost him the men whose names he wears on that bracelet." Eyes shifted to the metal band on Tom's wrist, the band he'd refused to remove. The supervisor slowly bowed his head. The three younger officers appeared ready to crumble. Hartley wasn't finished. "He fought until he was the last man standing," the director said, "refused evacuation twice, and held the line alone until reinforcements arrived at dawn. The Army calls him a hero." Hartley paused, letting silence swallow the space. "But the men who served with him called him something else." The director stepped closer. "They called him the Sentinel." The terminal fell into reverent stillness. Even those who didn't know the title felt the weight of it. Hartley lowered his salute and faced the trembling TSA officers. "You mocked a man whose courage holds up entire chapters of our military history, and you did so in public." The loudmouth officer's voice cracked. "Sir, I didn't know." "No," Hartley said sharply. "You didn't, because you never asked who he was, only what he looked like." Then Hartley turned back to Tom, voice softening. "Mr. Granger, may I escort you to your gate?" Tom nodded quietly. And as they walked together through the terminal, every single person they passed, civilians, pilots, flight attendants, TSA officers, stood in silence and bowed their heads. As Tom Granger walked beside Director Hartley through the terminal, the long stretch of polished floor ahead became a corridor of quiet reverence. People who had no idea who he was still felt the shift in the air, felt the weight of something enormous, something sacred. Pilots straightened. Airline captains paused mid-conversation and stepped aside. Gate agents lowered their heads. Even children went silent as their parents gently guided them out of the path of the two men. Tom felt the familiar ache in his knees, the old injuries that never healed, not fully. But he walked steady, shoulders squared, the faint echo of a soldier he had once been settling across his posture like an old, comfortable coat. "You didn't have to come yourself," Tom murmured without breaking stride. Hartley gave a small, almost amused breath through his nose. "Tom, for men like you, I would cross the entire country if needed. You know that. I'm just a tired old man heading to see my granddaughter," Tom said softly. "You're more than that," Hartley replied. "Far more." Behind them, the three young TSA officers stood in a rigid line near the checkpoint, pale as ghosts. The supervisor was already lighting into them quietly, the rebuke sharp and deserved, but Tom slowed his steps. "Sam," he said gently, "let me speak to them." Hartley hesitated but nodded. The two men turned around and walked back toward the trembling trio. The young officers froze as Tom approached, eyes wide, chests heaving slightly as they braced for whatever judgment was coming. Kyle, the loudest one earlier, stepped forward, his voice barely holding together. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know who you were." Tom studied his face, a young man barely older than some of the soldiers he'd watched fall in the valley so many years ago. The kid looked terrified and ashamed. "What's your name, son?" Tom asked quietly. "Kyle, sir. Officer Kyle Rivers." "Kyle," Tom said slowly, "I didn't want you scared. I never wanted that." Kyle blinked rapidly, fighting the sting in his eyes. "But you mocked me without knowing me. You judged me because I'm old, because I don't fit what strength looks like to you." Kyle's chin trembled. I regret every word, sir." Tom nodded. Then he placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, steady, warm, impossibly forgiving. Then let today be the day you grow, Tom said. Respect isn't about who looks strong, it's about who stood strong when it mattered. Kyle looked down, shame flooding him. I'll never forget this, sir. Tom nodded again, then turned to the other two officers and offered them the same soft wisdom, a reminder that every man, no matter how weathered, carries a story far deeper than appearances suggest. When he finished, the three officers looked transformed, chastened, humbled, and somehow better. Hartley rejoined Tom, and together they walked toward the gate where Tom's flight was waiting. Before boarding, Hartley stopped him. Tom, before you go, he held out something polished and familiar, a fresh challenge coin newly minted, marked with the DHS crest on one side and a phrase engraved on the other, for those who hold the line. Tom accepted it quietly, thumb brushing the metal. Thank you, he whispered. No, Tom, Hartley said, voice thickening, thank you. The final boarding call echoed softly through the terminal. Tom stepped onto the jet bridge, his faded red shirt glowing faintly under the overhead lights. And as he disappeared into the aircraft, Director Hartley turned to the gathered passengers and TSA staff and said only one thing: remember him. Men like him built the country you walk through today. And in that airport terminal, where just an hour earlier an old man had been mocked, all that remained now was silence, respect, and a story no one present would ever forget.